Stone remembers. Walk close enough to the base of a medieval keep, and the wall seems to keep a faint pulse. The rhythms of hammers, the breath of men at work, the slow, tireless movement of water hauling stone from quarry to shore. Castles across Europe stand as bookended contradictions, at once domestic theaters of hospitality and hearth, and blunt instruments of war and domination. They are monuments to taste and terror, to craft and coercion, to the intimate ordering of a household and the impersonal calculus of power. This film will track how those walls rose, why their forms changed, and what the labor of their making tells us about medieval society. If you want more films like this, stay until the end, subscribe, and like. Begin with The Hill, an earthwork crowned by timber, a motte and a bailey that could be raised in weeks by a lord who needed a quick claim on land. Before stone took root as the language of conquest, communities had long understood the basic grammar of defense: high ground, river crossings, thick palisades, and lines of sight. The Roman forts left traces, linear plans, and masonry know-how. But the kingdoms that emerged after the collapse of imperial order adapted and improvised. In the 11th century, the Normans brought a new urgency to castle building. Their conquest of England in 1066 was followed by an unprecedented surge of fortified construction. Motte and bailey across the countryside, timber keeps on earthworks, then the steady, patient replacement of wood by stone. Imagine a winter construction camp beside a new ditch. Men clustered around a small brazier, hands raw from hauling clay and lime. The foreman marks out a foundation with charcoal and cord. Quarrymen strike the first block, the sound a clear ring that travels across the scrub like a challenge. A mason's mark is cut, a private signature to be read by those who know the ways of stone. An identity, a tax, a ledger entry, and an artist's signature all in one. These human traces are easy to overlook when the stone has weathered into a uniform gray. They are the biography beneath the monument. Stonework is not brute force alone. It is a conversation between the form of a building and the materials offered by the land. Limestone, sandstone, and granite each answer to a different set of tools and joints. Ashlar faces, large dressed blocks with fine joints, demand time and skill. Rubble walls filled with smaller stones and mortar can be raised more quickly but are less refined. Mortar itself is an alchemy. Lime burned in a kiln, slaked with water, mixed with sand. The process of lime burning transforms chalk into a binding agent. In coastal Kent or the Welsh marches, the smell of burning lime mixed with coal smoke became a signature of construction seasons. A smell like this ties the distant spearhead of power to local labor: the king's order, the mason's plan, the quarry's toil. Castles are often thought of as simple fortresses, says Dr. Eleanor Martin, a medievalist who has spent years surveying Norman keeps. But they were planned systems, logistics, finance, and a network of specialist skills. The stone tells us as much about the economy as it does about the army that might storm it. Work is organized hierarchically. At the summit is the master mason, an individual part architect, part project manager, an engineer who speaks the geometry of arches and buttresses and also negotiates with patrons and overseers. Below him are freemasons and stonecutters, skilled artisans who shape voussoirs for arches and set quoins, cornerstones that will take the stress of the wall. Carpenters set up scaffolding and frame timber for hoists. Smiths make the pulleys and nails. Coopers supply casks of water and lime. Quarrymen hew the raw blocks. And a large body of unskilled laborers, haulage-jangs, women and men of the locale, supply the brute force of transport and stacking. Each role leaves its mark on the finished product. Reconstruction of a mason's instructions might sound like this: keep the coursing true, the joints shall be hairline, and set the plinth to take the first wash of winter rain. It may be a dramatized line, plausible rather than verbatim, but it captures the necessary precision. Those instructions shaped how a hall retained heat, how a curtain wall shed water, how a defensive tower could be scaled under fire. The leap from wood to stone was not merely an architectural decision, but a political one. Stone lasts longer, broadcasts permanence, and signals a claim that cannot be easily reversed by a rival lord or a fleeting uprising. William the Conqueror and his lieutenants replaced timber Motte and Bailey constructs with stone keeps at key points: Rochester, Dover, and the Great White Towers at London. The stone keep was a concentrated symbol, housing the Lord's Hall, the strong room, the private chapel, and the living quarters in one vertical unit. It centralized power and generated new domestic forms within its walls. But it also multiplied expense. Expense shaped design. A lord with limited means might fortify a single keep. An ambitious king conceived of rings of stone that encircled entire regions. The late 12th and 13th centuries witnessed a rapid evolution of architectural ambition. Chateau Gaillard, built by Richard I along the Seine, rose with astonishing speed. Contemporary chroniclers marveled at how towers appeared like mushrooms after rain. And behind the spectacle lay logistics of staggering complexity. Vast numbers of masons and laborers, imported stone, organized supply lines, and strict oversight from master builders. The chief engineer's ability to coordinate quarrying, shipping, and stonemasonry determined whether an ambitious plan would become a lasting reality or a ruinous debt. In construction, time is the other currency, says Professor Mark Hargraves, author of several studies on medieval logistics.
A hastily built defense can be breached or collapse under its own weight. A slow build risks the obsolescence of the political aim it was meant to serve. The masters had to thread that needle. Where a site posed natural defenses, promontories, rivers, islands, builders adapted. Dover Castle dominates a white chalk cliff, its keep an imposition upon both sea and land. Caernarfon and Harlech in Wales use natural rocky platforms, their curtain walls hugging the seaside and creating a silhouette of mastery against the horizon. When the ground refused to hold, engineers sank piles, drove timber foundations, or created spread footings of compacted rubble. Wells became strategic lifelines. A garrison without fresh water was no garrison at all. Deep cisterns and wells, sometimes sunk within inner wards, allowed a castle to resist siege for months. The act of sinking a well, lowering men in basketed harness down a narrowing shaft, swinging torches against the rock, is one of the most visceral images of construction, risk and reward condensed into a vertical corridor. On a windy morning at Caerphilly, a quarry worker might hand a dressed block to a mason, who, with a quick chalk mark, saws away the blemish and signs the face with a triangular mark. The echoing rhythm of stone setting, the grunt of men arranging a pulley, the creak of timber under load, all these sounds layered through the seasons. Within the castle, walls once whitewashed would be warmed by tapestries and painted plaster. The same structure that could project a grim silhouette also contained halls where roast meat steamed and wine was poured, where the Lord dispensed justice, and where children played under the watchful eyes of servants. This contrast between domestic warmth and martial purpose pervades medieval architecture. Yet castles were not neutral. They were instruments of control and sometimes of brutal policy. In Wales, the Edwardian program under Edward I after 1277 embodied both military acumen and colonizing intent. The ring of castles, Caernarfon, Conwy, Harlech, Beaumaris, were not mere fortifications. They were visual assertions of conquest, administrative centers, and seeds for English settlements that undermined native political structures. Local populations read these stones differently, as a challenge to autonomy, as a change in land tenure, as an imposition that altered the rhythm of markets and law. The castle was a theater of power, says Dr. Rodri Williams, specializing in Welsh medieval history. Its walls declared who would judge, who would tax, and where allegiance bent. For many Welsh communities, the castle was also a lived reality of displacement and new legal orders. The tension between craft and coercion appears in the record of forced labor and impositions on local populations.
Royal building programs required men, carts, timber, and beasts. Tolls and levies often filled the coffers of the crown, but emptied the resources of the local peasantry. Sources speak of corvée labor, compulsory service levied by lords for a season, and of taxes that diverted produce to supply armies and garrisons. Yet the record is nuanced. Peasants sometimes welcomed the new markets that sprang up near castles. They could find work as quarrymen, carpenters, or domestic servants. A single structure thus contained contradictory economic impulses, extraction, and opportunity. Technical innovation marched forward as designers confronted new problems. Early keeps were square and bulky, with solid corners that offered little resistance to undermining. Rounded towers, circular or polygonal, solved some of the corner weakness by distributing force more evenly and deflecting projectiles. The development of concentric design, multiple lines of curtain walls, each nested within the next, represented a philosophical shift. Defense could be layered. The artillery revolution centuries later would make some of these features obsolete. But in the medieval context, a concentric castle was a fortress of redundancy. The inner ward protected the last refuge. The outer ward absorbed assaults and provided space for counterattacks. Beaumaris, begun under Edward I in Anglesey, is often quoted as the apogee of concentric thought. Symmetry, measured bastions, and a plan that minimized blind spots. Construction techniques reflected an evolving understanding of structural forces. The pointed arch and ribbed vault, adaptations born from Romanesque experiments and later Gothic refinement, allowed weight to be carried down columns and piers rather than thick walls. A vaulted cellar could bear the weight of a hall above while freeing space for storage. Spiral staircases, often winding clockwise upward to favor defenders, compressed vertical communication into compact shafts that also served defensive ends. Murder holes and machicolations created vertical zones of defense, openings through which defenders could pour boiling liquid or hurl projectiles onto attackers at the base of a wall. Arrow slits, narrow vertically and splayed on the inside, allowed a wide field of fire for archers while presenting a tiny target to besiegers. The human scale of these innovations matters. A master mason did not draw blueprints in the modern sense, but worked with templates, full-size layouts, and rule-of-thumb ratios. Geometry mattered. The curvature of an arch, the rise-to-span ratio of a vault, the batter, inward slope, of a wall to help it resist lateral pressure. Skilled men measured with cords and basic compasses, set plumb lines, and used simple levels. A miscalculation could cause a collapsed arch and months of delay. The labor of proofing each stone, of ensuring that the bed joints fit with precision, was time-consuming and expensive, and the desire to perfect was often balanced against the need for speed when a king required a fast response to a military threat. Tension between perfection and pace is visible in the archaeological record, Professor Hargraves notes. Sometimes we find hurried repairs where a quick erection was needed. Other times a wall shows evidence of meticulous tooling that indicates long-term investment. These choices had political consequences. Richard I's Chateau Guillard, besides being an architectural marvel, exemplifies a concentrated burst of resources in response to a strategic need: the defense of the Seine and control of Normandy. The scale of mobilization involved fleets transporting dressed stone, teams of masons relocated temporarily to follow the works, and a standing of carpenters and blacksmiths that made the site an industrial hub for its lifespan. This economy of scale meant that local labor and resources could be temporarily overwhelmed, a boon to some, a burden to others. A dramatized fragment captures the tone of such a campaign: reconstructed dialogue, plausible dramatization. Bring the timber from the eastern quarter, lash the hoists tight. If the stones arrive by tide, we shall set 2 courses by the week's end. The foreman's estimation of tides, of number of men needed to raise a portal, of cost and time, was the fulcrum upon which strategic aims pivoted. The miracles of fast construction reach a climax with the Edwardian Ring in Wales. Edward I, intent on consolidating power after a series of rebellions, pursued a deliberate strategy: build, garrison, and plant. This was not merely about walls, but about urban and administrative order. At Caernarfon, the ambition went beyond defense. The palace and the royal symbolism, the polygonal towers, the banded stonework, the deliberate echoes of imperial Rome in the plan, conferred a narrative. This land had been claimed and was being civilized as the king intended. James of St. George, the celebrated master mason often associated with the program, brought continental experience to bear, blending functionality with spectacle. Yet spectacle costs. The crown's purse felt the strain. Wars, building, and the maintenance of garrisons demanded revenue. Taxes rose, the state borrowed. Accounts show the balancing act of medieval finance in stark numbers. Royal bankruptcy was never far from a monarch's mind. The very stones intended to secure a realm sometimes precipitated fiscal crises. A king faced a cruel arithmetic: build to hold territory or risk losing authority to rivals. Yet build too much, and the cost might leave the crown weak and vulnerable. Meanwhile, the ordinary workers shaped not only the walls, but the cultural life around them. Masons carved initials and marks that archaeologists now use to trace workshops. Itinerant craftspeople followed work orders from royal stewards, leaving patterns of migration in the record. Families might settle near a castle to service it: bakers, tanners, smiths. Walls created markets. They also curtailed older patterns of commerce by imposing tolls or shifting the centers of exchange. The castle is thus both seed and scythe. As the 13th century progressed, the technology of war altered the meaning of walls. Siege engines, counterweight trebuchets, for example, hurled massive stones that tested the limits of masonry. Responding to weight and kinetic force, architects thickened bases, rethought angles, and employed concentric layouts to absorb impacts. At the same time, the interior of castles grew more refined. Great halls were painted, plastered, and decorated with heraldry. Kitchens developed plum ovens and specialized spaces for victuals, and latrines were engineered to maintain sanitation within the curtain walls. Living standards in well-provisioned castles could be high. Servants prepared spice dishes, cloth-lined chambers reduced drafts, and tapestries kept rooms warmer. The castle's duality was thus reinforced. A place designed for war could also be a refined domestic space. It is tempting to imagine these constructions as inevitable progressions of military necessity. In truth, each advance represented choices made by men and institutions under constraints of politics, economy, and geography. A lord might choose to adorn his hall with carved stonework to signal prestige rather than to invest in an additional layer of defense. A king might gamble on a display of power to deter rebellion at the cost of stretching finances thin. The castle then reads like a ledger. Every arch is a debit against political objective. Every tower a credit in prestige. By the late 13th century, the scale of some English royal projects reached an apex. But even as stones rose, new questions emerged. How to supply these distant garrisons? How to maintain skilled labor in remote areas? How to stretch finance without provoking revolt? In that strain lay the kernel of the next challenge. Not an architectural problem alone, but a question of supply, logistics, and the stamina of a society committed to building monuments that would outlast themselves. The campaign had proven that men could raise wonders in seasons. The next test was whether the institutions that ordered them could sustain their maintenance and the human networks they depended upon.
That strain, the weary arithmetic of supply and personnel, found its clearest expression not in statutes or proclamations, but in the daily choreography that kept a garrison alive. A castle without food, without wood to mend a roof, without mortar to close a seam, was a hollow pride.
The practicalities of provisioning shaped strategic choices as much as the geometry of walls. How far could a royal detachment stray from a supply line and still return to bread and ale? How many oxen could a lord requisition without provoking open complaint? The answers were seldom abstract. They were written in parish rolls, in the rhythms of harvest, in the worn ruts of cartways leading to a castle gate. At the most basic level, the radius of support defined a castle's operational range. A garrison of several dozen men required not only daily victuals, but also stores for winter, fodder for the animals, and materials for repairs after storms or skirmishes. Where fields lay thin, where winters were long, the solution required stores, granaries and cellars, dovecotes and ice houses, and the labor to fill them. Central works like Caernarfon and Beaumaris were planned with this in mind. Their planners reasoned in days and weeks rather than months. But even the best-laid store could be exhausted by a siege or by the demands of a nearby campaign that drained the hinterland. Hence the recurrent medieval practice of seizing provisions in time of need, royal purveyance, local levies, the quartering of troops in farmsteads. These were blunt instruments. They solved immediate shortages, but eroded the goodwill on which lordship ultimately rested. More sophisticated techniques emerged. Royal stewards kept lists and accounts, deliveries of grain recorded, barrels of salted fish tallied, contracts with itinerant bakers and butchers renewed. Where the crown could, it built infrastructures, wharves on tidal rivers, improved ferries, warehouses at market towns to smooth the flow of supplies. Rivers became strategic arteries. A castle on a navigable stream could be provisioned much more cheaply than one perched above a valley with only poor tracks for access. Thus, geography and infrastructure co-determined the placement of permanent garrisons. Fortress sites that promised access to navigable water had a distinct logistical advantage. Yet, the Crown's capacity to manage logistics was only one axis of resilience. The other lay in social networks, the families and towns that grew around fortifications. A market near the gate was not merely an economic convenience, it was a strategic asset. Markets created incentives for local producers to grow surplus. Tolls and murage, the right to levy taxes for wall building and upkeep, generated revenue that could be reinvested in maintenance. Chartered towns that sprang up under royal or baronial protection often enjoyed privileges, safe conducts, exemptions, monopolies on certain trades that encouraged settlement and tied local prosperity to the castle's fortunes. Conversely, where a castle imposed excessive tolls or levied arbitrary exactions, it could strangle the very commerce that sustained it. This reciprocal logic extended to the world of craftsmen. Masons and carpenters were mobile specialists. Their signatures, masons' marks carved into ashlar, enable modern historians to trace their itineraries across counties and borders. A master mason might move from Chester to Caernarfon to Workington as contracts came and sent apprentices along with him. This mobility cut both ways. It concentrated expertise where work was abundant, but also made buildings vulnerable to the vagaries of the labor market. Wars or pestilence could thin the supply of skilled hands. When they did, the pace of building slowed and maintenance deferred. The Black Death, later in the 14th century, would make this point starkly. Sudden demographic collapse changed not only the price of labor, but the very expectations of long-term investment in stone. Fiscal instruments were continually reworked to meet these material realities. Kings tempered the bluntness of scutage and tallage with more targeted measures. Wardships and marriages of heiresses were sold to raise immediate cash.
The crown farmed certain revenues to wealthy financiers in exchange for ready payments. Customs duties at ports became increasingly important as the crown sought reliable income streams. In moments of acute need, monarchs resorted to borrowing from Italian merchants whose networks stretched across Europe, or to ad hoc levies that tested the patience of subjects. Yet each device came with consequences. Selling wardships concentrated power and could undermine local loyalties. Borrowing increased long-term obligations. Forced loans and heavy scutage could drive a realm toward instability. Beyond revenue, the maintenance of fortifications required institutional adaptations. The appointment of constables and castellans formalized responsibility. These officers were not merely soldiers. They were administrators charged with keeping the fabric intact, auditing stores, negotiating with townsfolk, mustering men-at-arms, and reporting back to the royal household. Some castellanies became hereditary in practice, passed within families who accrued local influence and sometimes used the castle as a power base that complicated royal authority. Other appointments remained strictly royal, an effort to keep strategic nodes under central control. When a constable proved negligent, the consequences were immediate. A rotten tower could invite an enemy, and the crown's reputation for protection could be diminished. Technological change further complicated maintenance. The 13th century reaction to trebuchets, thicker walls, rounded towers, concentric rings, had been effective for a time. But innovations did not stop. By the late 14th and 15th centuries, gunpowder and cannon began to enter the European military scene in earnest. Initially cumbersome and unreliable, artillery matured into a strategic disruptor. The high, thin curtain walls that had dominated Norman and Plantagenet construction were ill-suited to absorb the concussive force of iron shot.
In response, architects experimented. Lower profiles, thicker earthen ramparts behind stone faces, spurs and angled bastions that tried to deflect impact and provide platforms for defensive guns. These were not instantaneous transformations. They were iterative, regionally variable adjustments that turned fortress architecture into a conversation with new physics. The arrival of gunpowder also reframed the economics of fortification. Deeper, more complex earthworks required different materials and labor. Earth had to be moved in volumes that taxed local manpower. Timber revetments needed sustained maintenance against rot, and the engineering to mount guns demanded new trades. Smiths capable of producing and repairing barrels, specialists in the manufacture of black powder. Coastal strongholds facing the combined menace of foreign fleets and nascent naval artillery needed wharves and storehouses for shot. All of these needs raised costs in new directions, even as they diminished the efficacy of some older investments. The logic of building in stone did not vanish, but its primacy was contested. At the tactical level, the functions expected of castles evolved too. In the earlier High Medieval period, a successful castle held territory by denying access, by dominating a road or pass, by providing a refuge. With the rise of more mobile forces, mounted raiders, organized mercenary companies, and later armies centralized under royal banners, static defense was only part of the picture. Castles were nodes in a network, places to gather supplies, to house subsidies or arrested hostages, to coordinate patrols, to shelter administrative functions. They were also symbols to be targeted. The political impact of capturing a royal castle, even if militarily marginal, could be enormous. Slighting, the deliberate partial destruction of a captured fortress to ensure it could not be reused, became a common tactic. Slighting solved short-term strategic problems, but also had long-term consequences for the landscape. It removed anchors for markets, destroyed the homes of local craftsmen, and rewrote the cartography of authority. The human cost of these logistical and tactical shifts was considerable.
Peasants bore the weight of provisioning armies, their grain requisitioned, their animals impressed, their labor conscripted for earthworks. In return, they expected protection, exemptions, or rents reduced. When those expectations were unmet, rebellion flickered. The recurring pattern of tax protests, of parochial grievances turned political, linked the microeconomics of daily life to macro-level strategy. When kings overreached, when building campaigns coincided with poor harvests or epidemic, the legitimacy of their projects could crumble. Conversely, prudent investment in infrastructure and fairer forms of extraction could bind communities to the crown in durable ways. Landscape and environment adapted alongside institutions.
Quarrying for ashlar altered hillsides. The demand for timber for scaffolding, roof beams, and palisades shifted woodland management. In some regions, coppicing practices intensified to provide a steady flow of small timber suitable for construction, an ecological response to strategic demand. Roads were widened and improved, not only for the movement of troops, but to bring in lime, iron, and coal when it was practicable. In maritime zones, harbor facilities multiplied. In upland areas, packhorse routes acquired amenities, stabling, bridges, ford improvements. The building and upkeep of castles were thus part of a larger process of economic integration, one where strategic priorities left visible marks on the countryside. Cultural practices codified some of these changes. The ritual of feeding a garrison, the seasonal musters, the records of victualling became part of a growing administrative vocabulary. Legal arrangements, murage charters for defensive towns, markets chartered under protection, exemptions granted to artisans provided frameworks that both protected and harnessed local economies. In times of peace, castles became seats of justice and governance. Sheriffs held assizes within their halls, escheators collected rents, and chancery writs were read aloud in courtyards. Thus, the fortress, even as its military utility waxed and waned, remained central to the daily governance of a realm. Yet the very centrality of castles attracted new forms of political contest. As royal governments became more sophisticated, they also became more demanding. The administration expected accounts. Stewards were required to justify expenditures. The need for transparent stewardship and for men of trust in remote castellanes increased bureaucratic burden. Some castellans excelled, turning their charges into profitable enterprises of management and local patronage. Others became a source of corruption, extracting unauthorized dues or failing to maintain fortifications until an enemy or accident revealed the negligence. The record is ambivalent. Castles saved kings and cities alike, but they also multiplied points of failure. By the close of the medieval High Period, therefore, a paradox had emerged. Stone fortresses were both monuments to power and liabilities that required constant replenishment of political capital. The scale of investment possible in the 1270s and 8080s under Edward I had been impressive because it had rested on a narrow window of royal capacity, military dominance, available skilled labor, and a treasury willing to stretch. Sustaining such projects across decades, through succession crises, fiscal shocks, demographic catastrophe, demanded institutional depth. Where that depth faltered, castles decayed. Where it held, they remained consequential. And yet, the horizon beyond the immediate balancing act already invited a deeper transformation. The tactical innovations of new artillery, the demographic ruptures to come with plague, the steady growth of professionalized infantry and standing retinues, all hinted that fortification would face a fundamental redefinition. Some lords responded conservatively, reinforcing medieval layouts and hoping for the best. Others experimented boldly, reshaping earthen profiles, constructing lower, thicker curtain walls and platforms for gun emplacements. In the borderlands between England and Wales, and along the coasts facing continental rivals, these experiments proliferated. They were, however, neither uniform nor decisive at once. The medieval world was full of hybrid solutions, stone and earth combined, crenellations adapted to cannon ports, Keeps provided with artillery embrasures cut into their walls. The true test would be strategic rather than purely architectural. Could the institutions that maintained fortresses retool themselves to support a new technology, to fund new kinds of construction, to train new classes of specialists? Or would the weight of legacy, debts incurred for concentric rings, tenurial obligations grounded in an older order, social compact between town and castle, inhibit adaptation and thereby shift the balance of power elsewhere? The answer would vary by region, by ruler, and by moment. For now, in the chill light that follows a season of extraordinary building, the question animating councils and chancery rolls alike was practical and inescapable. Who would extract the coin, marshal the carts, feed the men, and carry out the repairs that ensured a fortress remained what it had been conceived to be, not merely a symbol, but a functional arm of power? It was into that fraught administrative and material landscape that a new century would deliver calamity and opportunity in equal measure. The events that followed, pestilence, shifting military doctrines, political ruptures, would test the adaptability of institutions forged during eras when the primary enemy had been human rivals rather than the slow corrosion of time and technology. The castles that survived would be those whose keepers had not only built well, but had woven their structures into resilient human networks, grain stores that could be drawn down and replenished, bridgeworks that allowed supplies to pass in winter, networks of craftsmen capable of relaying foundations after a bombardment. Those that failed would teach a harsher lesson. Stone alone could not secure dominion. It required the living economy and the political will to sustain it. The story of maintenance, then, is not only about masons and mortar. It is the story of fiscal imagination and of social bargains, of the ways in which communities and rulers negotiated mutual dependencies. It is a history of supply convoys and market days, of the long shadow cast by a single tax decision, of the slow accumulation of small repairs that together preserved a fortress for another generation. The story of maintenance, then, is not only about masons and mortar. It is the story of fiscal imagination and of social bargains, of the ways in which communities and rulers negotiated mutual dependencies. It is a history of supply convoys and market days, of the long shadow cast by a single tax decision, of the slow accumulation of small repairs that together preserved a fortress for another generation. As the 14th century dawned, that shadow lengthened, and with it the demands on those who would hold the line. In the next phase, both catastrophe and innovation would accelerate change. Pestilence would reduce the pool of labor and tilt the economics of maintenance. Protracted wars would strain royal coffers and force new financial instruments into being. Artillery would steadily reshape the vocabulary of defense. The castles of the high medieval boom would therefore stand at a crossroads. To be adapted into the artillery age, or to be allowed to crumble, memorials to an older logic of power. The strategic, economic, and human choices made then would determine which fortresses endured as living centers and which faded into ruins dotting the landscape.